Good morning, everybody, and welcome. This is the SWSEIC Wildlife Recorders Gathering 2021. This is the first time we've held one of these meetings online, so we're keeping our fingers crossed that all the technology works according to plan. But if it doesn't, if you just try and bear with us a little bit. My name is Peter Norman. I'm the Project Officer at SWSEIC. My colleague Mark Pollard is also here this morning, but he's driving the technology at the moment. You will see and hear from Mark later on. There he is. Normally in these sort of meetings we begin with a little bit of housekeeping. That's slightly different on an online meeting. I presume you know where your own toilets and fire escape are. If you do hear sirens and see flashing lights, no need to panic. It's just the fact that I live next door to a fire station. You can also obviously go and get a cup of tea and coffee whenever you choose to go and get a cup of tea and coffee, but we will be having a 10-minute break in the middle, so that will enable you to go and top up your tea and coffee without missing any of the presentations. The announcements that I do have are to do with the technology. At the top of the screens, you should find a button which says View, and you do have some control over what you see on your screen at any time. That doesn't affect what everybody else sees, so feel free to play around with that. All the microphones and cameras of the audience are turned off. We're not planning to have any of the audience on screen unless there's a pressing need to do so. We are recording this morning's event, but we're only recording the speakers. We're not recording anything from the audience. However, we would like to get you involved, for you to get involved. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a number of different buttons. There's the one that says Chat, and you can use that whenever you like to speak to other members of the audience. We will keep half an eye on it, but we won't be following it closely. There's another button that says Q&A. That is specifically to ask questions of the speakers or any general questions to do with wildlife recording. We'll keep a closer eye on that, and we'll do our best to answer the questions, but obviously when the speakers are speaking, they're not going to be able to answer the questions immediately. So we should get round to most of the questions at some point, so feel free to ask them whenever a question jumps into your head. You'll also see you've got an option to, if there's any questions that anybody else likes, that you like, anybody else asks that you like, there's a button there, a little thumbs up sign. You can click on that to support somebody else's question. If we do get time after the speakers have finished speaking, we'll answer some of those questions live on screen. But otherwise, if there's lots of questions, we'll just answer them via text. So as I said, this is the first time we've had a recorders gathering online. In 2018, we had a recorders gathering in East Asia. In 2019, we had it in Dumfries and Galloway. And in 2020, we had a meeting in South Ayrshire. A few weeks after that meeting was in early March 2020. And a few weeks after, I don't need to remind you, the whole world changed. And it's not got back to the way it was since then. 2021 would have been the turn of North Ayrshire to host the meeting. We were optimistic at one point we would have an in-person meeting in North Ayrshire, but that has turned out not to be the case. It's still a little bit uncertain in terms of the COVID position. So we've had a number of we've had a number of walks in North Ayrshire over the last couple of weeks. Some of you may have been on them, and we've got another one coming up on the 20th of November. But we've kept the main meeting just to an online event. we have worked in North Asia. SWSEIC has worked in North Asia for the last 3 or 4 years with Garnock Connections Landscape Partnership. We've helped out with various things, bioblitzers, and setting up a recording system for the Landscape Partnership. But we're pleased that Garnock Connections is supporting today's event, and we're very grateful for Garnock Connections supporting today. But we're very pleased to have with us this morning Miriam Lord, who's the Wildlife Recording Assistant with Garnock Connections Landscape Partnership. And we're going to kick off with a presentation from Miriam. She's going to tell us about some of the places and some of the wildlife that is to be found in the Garnock Valley. So if you know the area, hopefully she'll be talking about some of the places that are familiar to you. But if you don't know the area, it's a good opportunity to find out a little bit more about it and maybe visit at some point in the future. So if you would like to unmute yourself, Miriam, I'll hand over and leave it to you for the next half an hour or so.
Thanks, Peter. I'll just get my slides up on the screen. So hopefully that has worked. As Peter said, I'm the Wildlife Recording Assistant for Garnock Connections, and my job is basically to get people out into nature and get them recording wildlife. So I've been working with SWSEIC throughout my time at Garnock Connections with the activity that we've set up on iRecord to get more records of the wildlife in the Garnock Valley. So in my talk, I'm going to do a sort of a whistle-stop tour of some of the best places to watch wildlife in the Garnock Valley. I can't cover everything. It's a really great area for wildlife, but hopefully this will give you a snapshot of the habitats that are around us here, if you are not already familiar with them. And if you are, then hopefully some of the species that I mentioned might be of interest to you as well. So the Garnock Valley is a geographically defined region. It follows the River Garnock from the source to the sea, and it covers all of the major tributaries to the river from their source. So it stretches from Muir Regional Park in the north to Irvine in the south. So it's quite a varied area in terms of habitat, following the river all the way up from the uplands down to Irvine. So we're going to start at Muir Country Park. So this is right at the north of the Garnock Valley, and it's the highest altitude area in the Garnock Valley. And it's basically a moorland, and that moorland is comprised of blanket bog and unimproved grasslands. So it supports the typical upland species. It's particularly lovely in spring and summer, as we get our avian summer visitors arriving, like the wheatear and the skylark and the cuckoo. So I actually went up to Muir earlier this year in April, and I was hoping to see cuckoos and spent a couple of hours up there. Heard one, didn't see any. On the drive back down, saw 7. So it can be really fantastic for cuckoos, and really good views as well. Some other interesting species up there on Scottish moorland, the green hair streak almost exclusively uses bilberry or blaeberry as its food plant. So it's one of the few places in the Garnock Valley where you can see green hair streaks. And it's the same for the blaeberry bumblebee, which also uses blaeberry bushes as its food plant. So moving kind of downwards into the center of the valley from the uplands is the River Calder. So the Calder Glen flows right from the Renfrewshire Heights, and it goes all the way through Loch Winnock. and it goes from some really lovely upland areas into valley woodland. So on in the Renfrewshire Heights, the damp moorland and grassland is a really good place to find orchids, so particularly the heath-spotted orchid and the greater butterfly orchid. The greater butterfly orchid is actually more common down in the valley in grasslands, but it does grow on the heights, so it's worth looking out for it if you're up there looking for the heath-spotted orchids as well. If you want to find a hairy stonecrop and mossy saxifrage, you need to actually look by the streams or in wet stony areas, because instead of growing on the grassland, they like the kind of the damper, rockier areas. And hairy stonecrop in particular is a really great find. It's exclusively an upland species, and it only grows in parts of northern England and parts of Scotland. So it's a really nice thing to see. Down further into the valley, the Calder Glen has some lovely riparian woodland, some of which is quite old, quite well established. And it's the shady banks down there are a great place to find plants like moscatel. And you can also find golden saxifrage. So by the stream sides and in the boggy ground, there's a lot of opposite leaved golden saxifrage, but there is also some alternate leaf golden saxifrage growing. They're very similar. The only real difference kind of visually is the arrangement of the leaves and the flowers. So it requires some kind of careful examination to make sure you've got the right one, but there is some alternate leaf golden saxifrage growing there. And finally, the early purple orchid seems to really like the damp ledges going up the glen, and it's really lovely to see that growing there, because it is declining in Scotland partly because of some the loss of woodlands. So we're moving now down the River Calder as it flows through Loch Winnock into Loch Semple, which is right where RSPB Loch Winnock is. And this is possibly one of the kind of most well-known sites, particularly for bird watching in the Garnock Valley. So the RSPB reserve covers, in terms of water bodies, the Barloch and the Aird Meadow. And these two water bodies are actually a triple SI because they are eutrophic, which is quite unusual. So it means that the water has a really high level of nutrients, and those nutrients support a lot of plant life, and that in turn gives a lot of resources for wildfowl. So wildfowl numbers are greatest in the winter. Some of the wetland bird survey counts have had over kind of 1,200, 1,300 birds on the Barloch in recent years. And most of them are goldeneye, widgeon and tufties, but there are good numbers of hooper swans, great crested grebes and goosanders as well. Good thing to note if you're planning a visit to Loch Winnock this winter and you'd like to see some of the wildfowl, if you want to go to the Barloch, I would recommend going earlier in the morning, because in the afternoon the sun turns all of the ducks into dark silhouetted blobs, which are very difficult to identify even with a scope. So early morning visit is the best kind of time. There are also kind of rarer species recorded every year. The 3 species here are pretty much annual. And also there are occasionally smew in winter, redheads, and some of them, it's really lovely. You watch them molt through into their drake breeding plumage. The semi-official bird of Loch Winnock is the great crested grebe, and that's partly because the eutrophic nature of the lochs really support the great crested grebes. So great crested grebes do best in water bodies where the nutrient levels are quite high. And Loch Winnock is actually at sort of the northerly end of the great crested grebes range in the UK. So it's quite an important reserve for them. And this year, I think they've reported 8 breeding pairs, and that's an increase. So hopefully we'll continue to see that go up and you can get really good feeds of these on the Erd Meadow. I will just mention there are some lovely new scrapes at Loch Winnock. So typically it's known as a reserve for its wildfowl, but these scrapes are designed for waders. So this area used to be channels with really steep grassy banks, deep channels, deep water, and it's now very shallow water with lovely shallow muddy slopes. And this is really ideal wader habitat. So the Garnock Valley is actually a migratory flyway. So there are a lot of birds which pass over the reserve. And the hope is that this new habitat will encourage them to drop down onto the reserve to feed up on their migration. Some informal nocturnal migration surveys have recorded things like golden plover, whimbrel, greenshank, redshank, etc., flying over. So this is very much a kind of watch this space place for waders. Already, though, we've got resident snipe and lapwing really enjoying the new mud. A green sandpiper dropped in for quite a few days, and I know it's not a wader, but great white egret also hung around for a couple of weeks. So increasingly, with warming temperatures, great white egrets are a bird that we might see more regularly in the Garnock Valley. It's also worth hanging around until dusk at Loch Winnock. In summer, you get great experience of all of the reeling grasshopper warblers and chipping and drumming snipe. So an amazing thing to see the snipe creating that drumming sound just with the air through their tail feathers. You might also see harriers and a barn owl hunting over the scrub at dusk. We're moving now from Loch Winnock southwards to an area which has several raised bog habitats. So these are in the kind of the agricultural lowlands around Beath and Barmill, and they're quite different to blanket bog, which is the kind of bog that you find on the uplands. So raised bogs are lowland habitats, and they're small and discreet instead of a kind of a big carpet over the bog. Over the uplands even. So they're almost like an island of peat. They do support some of the same species as blanket bog, particularly the acid-loving mosses, cotton grasses and heathers. I've put this slide together just to show how colourful bogs can be, because I think there's a misconception that they're often just kind of like quite brown, quite green, not very interesting in terms of, visually appealing. And this slide, I think, just goes to show how diverse the mosses are and how colourful they are. You can actually tell how healthy a raised bog is by the number of different moss species which grow there. And these photos were all taken at White Moss. So like I said, the raised bogs support a lot of the same species that you might find on blanket bog. And a lot of this is because they're commonly found growing with sphagnum mosses, which you also find on blanket bog. So marsh violet, cranberry and sundew, the carnivorous plant, the sundews, they're all found growing with sphagnum mosses. If you're on a raised bog and you find white beak sedge, that's a really good sign. So it's a good one to look out for. It's much more sensitive to drainage than the other species here. So if it's growing, it suggests that the raised bog is in pretty good nick. It's a good indicator of habitat health. Also worth taking a bug pot with you if you go to the raised bog. So all the photos here were taken by one of our recorders from, I believe, White Moss. And some of these species are specifically kind of their life cycle is intertwined with the bog species, like this hieroglyphic ladybird, which feeds off erica heaths like cross-leaved heath. And the cotton grass fanner, this slightly drab looking moth here, lays its eggs on cotton grass, and then the larvae actually use the fluffy seed heads to spin their cocoons. And the record of the gorse weaver spider here is one of the most northern records in the UK, if not the most northerly record. So it's a really good one to look out for. So we're now jumping all the way down to the coast of North Ayrshire, to Ardrossan, Saltcoats and Stevenston. This is a really great place for sea watching, particularly if you have a scope. Again, too many sites really to cover in this talk, but just generally, you can see a lot of birds all year round. So the divers present all year round, like the red-throated diver, sea ducks like the common scoter, also present, slightly more unusually things like long-tailed ducks, but also good numbers of eider. The best time really is on autumn passage, so the migration, when a lot of birds are moving south along the coast. You can often see skuas, and most years all of the skua species are recorded moving down the Ayrshire coast. And they're great to watch, especially if you can see them feeding. They're what's known as kleptoparasites, so they will chase other birds to steal their food. They're kind of like the pirates of the pelagic seabirds. You can also see dolphins, whales and sharks off Ayrshire. It's a really well-known spot for them. It is useful, as I said, to have a scope if you're sea watching, because a lot of stuff can be pretty far out. And it's also useful to go with somebody who's got quite a bit of experience, because it can be a little bit overwhelming sometimes when you're looking out into the vast ocean and everything is really far away. You don't need to go or to look all the way out to sea though, because a lot of the beach and the dune systems along here, particularly near Stevenston, are also really great places to look for wildlife. So particularly, as I said, at Stevenston Local Nature Reserve, the dune system is actually undergoing some restoration, and the beaches are a really good place to see waders all year round. So we have resident waders there, ring plover, and wintering waders like dunlin, sanderling. But again, autumn passage is a really good time to spot anything kind of more unusual coming in. So particularly juveniles, as they fly down the coast, they stop off at sites like this to feed. So things like little stint, golden plover, curlew sandpiper and ruff. In the winter, the Strand Line is also a great place to see flocks of finches and buntings, snow bunting, white, linnet, things like that. And you can get really good views of these with just binoculars, so no scope required for this one. Not just birds though. This lovely sort of slightly unprepossessing plant here, the Isle of Man cabbage, is thought to only occur in, I think it's fewer than 50 hectares globally. So it's very, very localized, and it's endemic to Britain. So it's a native plant that only grows in Britain. So quite a cool one to see. Some really interesting coastal moths as well, like this bordered sallow, and also some great bees. And this bee here is, I think it's right at the northern end of its range, and it's considered scarce in the UK. So this is a great habitat for some of the rarer invertebrates. Moving south again to Irvine, we reach the mouth of the Garnock as it flows into the sea. So just before it meets the sea, there's a confluence between the Garnock and the River Irvine. And this is also a really good area for bird watching. I've talked a lot about the birds that you can see in this area though, so I won't go into lots of detail here, but one particularly good thing to note is the short-eared owls over the race courses. So this is the only British owl, apart from the short-eared, the little owl, sorry, that you can really see it hunting in the daytime. And you can get excellent views of this on the race course. And It's amazing because it's not an easy bird to see normally, despite it hunting in the daytime. So that's something that is really worth going to look for. In the final part of my talk, I'm going to run through some of the smaller reserves around Irvine, which are collectively known as the Irvine Green Spaces. And these are all run by the Scottish Wildlife Trust. And they're really lovely as they're really accessible, but they also have really, really excellent wildlife. So there's a really good kind of combination of accessibility and wildlife value as well. So first off, this lovely woodland is mostly birch, and it's a great place for lots of wildlife actually, but it's also a really lovely place to go on a hunt for fungi. There aren't actually any really rare species recorded here. There's just a lot of species recorded, and a lot of them are very lovely to look at. So these photos are all from one of our recorders, and my particular favorite is this alder tongue. So the red tongue shape that you see here is not actually the fungus, it's a distortion of the fruiting body on the alder, which is caused by a chemical that the fungus releases inside. So the fungus is actually, you don't really see that, but this amazing tongue shape coming out is a sign that it's infected with the fungus. And then to finish off, I've clustered several sites together here. They're all excellent for invertebrates, which is why I've done that. Gales Marsh is a mixture of kind of dry grassland, marshy areas, and also some mixed woodland. And it's right by some of the dune systems and also Gales Links, which is in the top right of the slide here. And together they're a really good place to see mining bees. So the bare sandy ground on those places supports a lot of quite rare invertebrates, and notably, I'm told, the Tormentil mining bee is found here, and that's scarce in the UK, so that's one to look out for. Chiltern sandpits supports a similar diversity of species, and Chiltern Woods has records for 10 dragonfly species, which is quite unusual. A lot of the invertebrates here are unfortunately not hugely photogenic and don't have common names, so they don't really lend themselves to a kind of picture-filled presentation. But even for people who aren't into separating all the different mining bees and wasps and things, there are some really lovely species which have been recorded in that area. You could do these with kind of binoculars or a good camera. So there was a small blue introduction program at Gales Marsh. Any records of a small blue in that area would be absolutely amazing. So it's definitely one to look out for. It used to be reasonably common many years ago, but became locally extinct. There is a single record of a large skipper, and that's one of the most northerly records in the UK. So with temperatures warming, we might see more large skippers in kind of the coastal habitats like Gales Marsh. And that's the same for the migrant hawker as well. So only very few records up here, but again, potentially increasing in the future. The small pearl-bordered fritillary and the four-spotted chaser are relatively regularly recorded in the area. Really lovely to see. The small pearl-bordered fritillary is actually one of my favorite butterflies. And it's also a species of kind of conservation concern. It's one of the biodiversity action plan species, which means that its management is being kind of designed specifically for this butterfly to help it thrive in the areas where it's living. So finally, we're kind of at the end of the whistle stop tour, and I want to say over to you. I'm sure a lot of you are already quite familiar with some of the things that I've talked about in my presentation, but it would be fantastic if experienced and novice wildlife recorders alike could get out into the Garnock Valley, and it would be wonderful if this has inspired people to get out and find some new places. And if you do, please let us know what you find.
Thank you very much, Miriam. That was excellent. Certainly the Garnock Valley wasn't an area that I knew very well until I started working with Garnock Connections over the last few years. But certainly made lots of good discoveries, and hopefully I'll continue to make lots more. We haven't had a huge lot of questions come in so far, but somebody has been asking about our deer, which has been in the news a lot recently. Can you maybe say a little bit, for those people who are not familiar, where our deer is and why it's important, and if you have any news on the current position with the Ardea Peninsula?
Yeah, a little bit. You might be better placed to answer some of this than me, Peter. But Ardea is, the peninsula is located kind of around the three towns area, so Saltcoats, Stevenson and Ardrossan. It's in between there and Irvine, sorry. And as Peter says, it has been in the news recently. Peter, do you know anything about the current kind of status of it?
Well, historically it was explosives factory.
Yeah.
Those people in Dumfries and Galloway may know Dalbeattie and Carscowan, which were also explosive factories, run actually in conjunction with Ardea. Ardea was the main factory, and the Dumfries and Galloway ones were the outlying factories. So it's had a history of industrial use. Because of that, it's been earmarked for future industrial use. But since the explosives factory closed down, there's been a huge lot of wildlife found there, including lots of rare species. So the conservation sector is pushing to protect the wildlife that is found there and to prevent it being destroyed by future industrial use. The only thing I'm aware of recently is that I know it was in the news, the national news, when they were looking for potential sites for a new nuclear power station, and that's not nuclear as in what we've had in the past, but nuclear fusion rather than fission. I think it's still a long way off, but Ardea was certainly on the list of, it was the only site on the list in Scotland of potential locations. As I say, I think anything that's going to happen along those lines is some distance away. But there is a local group which is fighting hard to get the wildlife recognised and to get the site removed from the list of sites that are potential for future industry because it's so good for wildlife. Okay, is there anything else you'd like to add, Miriam, from what you've said just there?
Only that I got in touch with Jill Smart, who manages a lot of the Scottish Wildlife Trust reserves, and she sent me a very extensive list of invertebrates from Ardea, right. Many of which, like I said, don't have common names. You know, they're quite sort of specialist species in terms of identification, but a lot of them did have kind of scarce or rare status in Scotland or in the UK. It, you know, I think there's good grounds for it being given some kind of protection in the future, although obviously there's kind of conflict of interest with the development of the kind of the power industry. So yeah, I'll have to see, I think, what happens with it.
Okay, thanks, Miriam. That was excellent. If anybody would like to ask any questions of Miriam, then use the Q&A button. And now Miriam's finished talking, she'll have a better time to be able to answer any of those questions. Thanks, Miriam. Our next speaker is Danilele Muir from the British Dragonfly Society. Like me, Danielle's history is as a countryside ranger, but she now works part-time for the British Dragonfly Society, 2 days a week. She's the conservation officer for Scotland. The rest of the time she runs, I don't know how she fits it all in actually, she runs Perthshire Wildlife, which does various conservation projects, and she leads tours to see beavers in Perthshire. So if you're looking to see a beaver, you know where to go now. She also runs Celtica Wildflowers, which is a native wildflower nursery. But she's here in a British Dragonfly capacity, and she's going to tell us about the State of Dragonflies report, which was published earlier this year. And I know she's got a pre-recorded presentation, but I think, Danilele, you're going to say a few words just to begin with.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. How's the sound? Is it okay?
Yes, sounds good.
Okay, right. Yeah, thanks very much for having me along today. We do have a pre-recorded talk by Dave Smallshire, who is an important member of the Dragonfly Conservation Group. So he's going to give an overview of the State of Dragonflies report from this year. It was just released maybe two months ago, 6 weeks ago. And then I'll give a brief update on how dragonflies are faring here in Scotland, with a focus on the two rare species that I work with, the azure hawker and the northern damselfly. So I'll pass back over to you to do Dave's talk, and then I've got about 5 minutes of slides after that.
Dragonflies and damselflies are large predatory freshwater insects, and as such they're regarded as good indicators of both climate change and the condition of our wetlands. So publication of the State of Dragonflies in Britain and Ireland 2021 marks a significant step in plotting the fortunes of these wonderful insects. Dragonfly monitoring really began at the national scale with the production of this distribution atlas in 1996. It was followed up by a second atlas in 2014, which was able to plot changes in distribution at the 10 km² scale, and also made the first attempts at producing dragonfly trends. Another of the products was to look at the species richness in those hectads or 10 km² across the countries. And here in the records up to 1990, you can see a concentration of high species richness in the south of Britain. Compare that with the records up to 2019, which show a considerable increase in species richness in southern Britain in particular, but also note the changing colours in Scotland and Ireland. We started looking at the production of dragonfly trends more than a decade ago and embarked on a pilot monitoring scheme which used counts obtained from transects over a 4-year period. Unfortunately, the inevitable conclusion from this pilot scheme was that we were never going to get enough people with appropriate time and skill to carry out enough transects to produce robust population trends for dragonflies. During this time, however, there was a Dutch statistician called Arco van Stryen who was working on occupancy detection modelling, and this looked at the presence or absence of dragonfly species rather than numbers, and he looked at 1 kilometre square or monad occurrences, and this was a reasonable surrogate measure of site occupancy. And the great strength of it was that it used records that we already have. So the majority of records in our database are obtained without any statistical robustness, I suppose we could say. So we didn't do any random sampling. They were very much ad hoc records gathered by people with a range of time and expertise, and accumulated over many years. And it would be great if we could use this data set to produce trends. And thankfully this has proved the case. Here the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology took on this method, this modelling technique, and were able to produce the first trends over a 30-odd year period for our second Dragonfly Atlas. And since then there's been further refinement of the methodology. So what we've done currently is to take over 1.4 million records from a 50-year period, and the UKCH researchers have undertaken occupancy detection modelling to produce the basis of the State of Dragonflies 2021. The important results from the occupancy detection modelling come in the form of changes over the 50-year period and also trends in occupancy. Now we have 46 resident and regular migrant species in Britain and Ireland, and no less than 19 of these increased significantly in occupancy. So that's 41% of our species increased. Compared with that, only 5 declined. That's 11%. So nearly 4 times as many species increased as decreased in occupancy. In addition to those, another 5 increased and 3 decreased in at least one of the constituent countries, but not overall in Britain and Ireland. Now these results are somewhat contrary to the declines that have been widely reported for other species groups like birds, mammals, butterflies and moths. However, they're likely to reflect changes in climate and also the quantity and quality of our wetlands. So there isn't necessarily a good news story here. In fact, the results should give us some cause for concern. This graph shows the changes in occupancy over the 50-year period for all of our regular breeding and migrant species. Those above the 0 line have increased, those below it have decreased, and the coloured bars represent those that are statistically significant. The emperor dragonfly has expanded its distribution far more than any other species, 56% increase. Migrant hawker, the next one, has expanded by less than 30%. At the other end of the scale, emerald damselfly has contracted in range by 14%. So here's a list of the species that have increased most in Britain and Ireland, with that 56% increase by emperor right down in this list to beautiful demoiselle that increased by 9%. Now, as well as the change figures, 56% in the case of emperor dragonfly over that 50-year period, we also have trend lines. And you can see here quite a consistent increase in the case of emperor dragonfly. those increases over the 50 years were actually greater in England and Wales, 64 to 65%, and even higher in the Republic of Ireland, where emperors colonised. Now, these occupancy trends are used as surrogate measures of population. So although they're recording the frequency in monads in 1 kilometre squares, it's at that scale a much better indication of population changes than we would get from looking at hectads, the 10 kilometre squares that we use in atlases. Migrant hawker has also spread significantly northwards and across to Ireland. But as you can see, the trendline graph shows quite a concerted period of increase in the late 1980s. So that increase was even greater than the overall 28% in England, with a 36% increase in occupancy. The ruddy data also increased, although there hasn't been a massive change over the last 30 years. But again, like with the migrant hawker, the increase was greater in England than overall. At the other end of the scale, these 5 species showed the greatest statistically significant declines in Britain and Ireland. That the emerald damselfly showed the greatest decreases in occupancy came as a big surprise to us. As dragonfly recorders, we had no real idea that this species was contracting in range. And as you can see, it's an even greater contraction in England compared with Britain and Ireland overall. So this is something that needs some research effort, and we'll be keeping an eye on it, no doubt, in coming years. Unlike emerald damselfly, black darter has its strongest populations in the uplands and in the north of Britain and Ireland. And it may be that the reasons for the decline in this species are related very much to climate and possibly the habitat quality of our moorland blanket mires and the lowland raised mires and valley mires where they live. The distribution and habitat preferences of common hawker are very similar to those of black darter, and although we've seen a slightly smaller decline in occupancy in this species, you can see it's even higher, almost double, in England. So I think we're fairly confident that there are climate effects and habitat quality effects occurring here. Interestingly, black darter and common hawker have also been recorded in decline in some European countries. In England only, there was a significant decline in blue-tailed damselfly. And I'm highlighting this because there was a very sophisticated piece of research done in the Netherlands looking at blue-tailed damselfly productivity in watercourses, drains that were treated with neonicotinoid insecticides at various concentrations, but similar to those recorded in the real world. And I think it may not be a coincidence that the use of neonicotinoid insecticides in Britain from the 1990s rather, has possibly contributed to the blue-tailed damselfly's decline. It's something we'll have to keep an eye on, and certainly there are signs that neonics in watercourses are damaging wildlife more generally. Many of you will be aware that we've had some new kids on the block over the last 20 years or so. The small red-eyed damselfly came into Essex in 1999, and there's been a very large increase since then, and it's now found across England and South Wales from Durham to Cornwall. Willow emerald came in more recently, and we've also seen a consolidation, I suppose, of occasional breeding by red-veined darter and to a lesser extent lesser emperor. Southern migrant hawker is still finding a foothold in the southeast as a breeding species, in the far southeast of England, but seems to be spreading, and we may well in the next few years find breeding sites elsewhere. We are, of course, also quite concerned about the fate of our rare species, and these are not necessarily well picked up by monitoring schemes because of their national rarity, but it's been heartening to find very significant increases in both scarce chaser and Norfolk hawker, moving generally westwards from eastern strongholds in England. At the other end of the scale, some decreases in those three species. White-faced darter, which we lost from southern England, from Surrey and the home counties, about nearly 30 years ago now. Small red damselfly suggesting a small decrease in this nationally scarce species, but we have a little bit of evidence to suggest that they might be capable of spreading during hot weather events. And scarce blue-tailed damselfly, always a transitory species coming into suitably new sites before they vegetate over, so able to come and go. And maybe that decrease is a temporary feature, provided there are suitable new habitats being created for it. Now, we can't just show these declines and increases without any sort of explanation. However, the science behind what's driven these changes is incomplete, I think, and we've used what science there is available and our expert opinions to try and offer some explanations as to what may have been going on. You'll find more detail in the report itself, but one of the factors we stress as being of very great importance, and we know this not just in Britain and Ireland, but also across Europe and indeed across North America, and almost certainly in all parts of the inhabited world: climate change. So in Britain and Ireland, in Britain we've seen temperatures almost 1 degree Celsius higher over the 50-year period, and not quite as warm, but also warmer in the winter months too. Rainfall has increased both in summer and to a lesser extent in winter, but ironically there's been an increasing risk of droughts because of those hot temperatures and rather patchiness of rainfall events. So these extreme weather events have become more frequent. We've had record high temperatures and flooding events that seem to be increasing in frequency. All of these likely to have had profound effects on dragonflies. However, we've also had the confounding factors, I suppose, of wetland losses and creation and restoration. So we do know that in the last century and before that there were some large drainage schemes, and a lot of land was drained, bogs were drained, marshy land was drained, and ponds were lost through neglect sometimes, otherwise also direct infilling. So maybe we lost 1 million ponds, for example, in England and Wales. Perhaps more recently, though, we've seen the construction of large reservoirs for drinking water and other purposes. Lakes have been created, often in the aftermath of mineral workings, so sand and gravel pits, clay pits and so on have been flooded. And there have been many smaller ponds created, including on farmland and of course in gardens too. And there have been some very notable examples of large-scale reversions of arable to wetlands and removal of forestry to restore blanket bog, the mires, particularly in the flow country of the north of Scotland. And we've also seen, equally profoundly, changes in wetland quality, water quality. So pollution through acidification of waters and eutrophication, so the enrichment with nutrients, particularly from fertilizers and from treated sewage. These are bound to have had quite profound effects on the larval life for dragonflies. Okay, so I would encourage you to go to the British Dragonfly Society website and have a look at the full report. You can download it and read it at your leisure. Many people have contributed to the production of this report, but I have to highlight and give special thanks to over 17,000 dragonfly recorders, our citizen scientists who go out and record and submit records so that we can do this sort of analysis. And of course, the British Dragonfly Society's local county dragonfly recorders who elicit records, collate them and verify them. But thanks to everyone for helping to produce the State of Dragonflies in Britain and Ireland 2021.
So I'm just going to share my screen now. Hopefully you found that interesting. To give you a bit more of a view of what's going on here in Scotland. So yeah, so there has been a real shift in movement to the north by many dragonfly species. So I'm just going to have a quick look at those first. So certainly in the southwest, I know that you've seen quite an increase in breeding numbers of dragonflies from about 10 years ago to maybe 17 breeding species in Dumfries and Galloway, certainly. So Emperor, I've been hearing the Emperor's breeding in quite a few locations there now. With our most northerly site that we now have recorded for Emperor is Forvey National Nature Reserve in Aberdeenshire. So just until about 2 years ago, the most northerly site for the Emperor having been recorded was at Muir National Nature Reserve in Fife, and then 2 years ago we got records from Forvey, and we've had more records coming in south of Forvey as well. And Banded Demoiselle, that's been moving north from the borders, and then last year we had quite a few records from East Lothian. And then it was quite exciting news just towards the end of the summer. We've got a dragonfly hotspot at Morton Lochs, and they recorded the Banded Demoiselle there for the first time just this year. The brown hawker, which up until previous years was recorded in the borders, is now breeding near Hamilton, and there's quite a few people visiting the ponds there to film the brown hawker ovipositing. And migrant hawker, it's been seen as far north as Aberdeenshire, and southern hawker, that's again been moving up from the south and is now well established in the Stirling area. And I saw my first southern hawkers ever. I think it was two years ago, Yeah, it wouldn't have been last year. Yeah, 2 years ago at we got a dragonfly hotspot at Villa Forest in Fife, and it was a female southern hawker. She was trying to lay her eggs in the wood of the boardwalk actually. So there's been a huge shift as our winters are warmer, and I presume that the dragonfly larvae that are overwintering, they're able to survive because our winters are slightly warmer. So just a quick look at good places to see dragonflies, because we all want to see wonderful dragonflies. So my work basically revolves around working on hotspots and key sites, and hotspots are good locations to see dragonflies, and we have 10 of them from Aberdeen in the north down to Carlaverock in the south, and they're good places to act as a focus for dragonfly action. So I run various training courses there, guided walks, and volunteer days during the autumn to manage the pond. So a great way to engage people and get them interested in dragonflies. So this is a task from a couple of years ago at Flanders Moss. And I also work on key sites, which are key sites. Key sites are sites with rare dragonfly species, so species such as northern damselfly or azure hawker, northern emerald, white-faced darter, and so on. And I just put in this photograph because we had a volunteer day at Morton Locks at the hotspot there on Thursday, and what a fantastic job everybody did. This pond that was almost overgrown with bulrushes is now almost bulrush free, so much better habitat for dragonflies there. So general move north by more southern species. I'm just going to touch quickly, because I know I've only got a few minutes, on the rare species work with azure hawker and northern damselfly. So this is what I'm funded to work with them through my Nature Scot funding. And these are both species that are found on the edge of the range. They're found only in Scotland and the UK. And through increased recorder effort, we are getting new records of these two species every year, though it's quite sad that there's the probable loss of the azure hawker population at Silver Flow National Nature Reserve. I think the last record was in 2016 or 2017 for larvae there. Mark might be telling us a bit more about that later on. But climate change and hotter summers, they're definitely having an impact on their habitat. So it's not just their habitat. I mean, there's all these different species that are moving north, and we don't really know how that's going to impact on the rarer species like azure hawker and northern damselfly. Certainly with northern damselfly, the azure damselfly, which 20 years ago was at the south of Fife, it's now worked its way up to about sort of Pitlochry to Deeside area, and it will be having some sort of an impact on the northern damselfly. I'm sure they'll be competing for the same food, so that's something that we really need to find a bit more about. Crowr Estate, which is a huge area of peatland, and that's only reachable by train or on foot or horseback or bike. There's no tarred roads into Crowr Estate, but this is probably one of the best sites that we know of for azure hawker. It's a huge estate. It's full of bog pools, and 2 years ago, Pat Batty, who's the Scottish Recorder, and I were there carrying out surveys of the bog pools to find hundreds of azure hawker larvae. So you can see there's an adult there on the left. They're quite small hawkers. They're on the wing fairly early on in the summer, from sort of mid-June to end of mid-May, I should say, to the end of July maybe. And this is the larvae on the right hand side. So it's a tub of mostly azure hawker larvae. They're the darker brown ones. They've got pale spots going down the back. And the other ones with the stripes on them, the brown and dark brown and light brown stripes, are the common hawker larvae, and they are more common than azure hawkers. Azure hawkers are quite rare. This is typical habitat here for them. Shallow bog pools where there's less competition from other species such as common hawkers. And usually there's hundreds of bog pools everywhere at Crowr, but in this summer, due to the drought, only the deeper pools retained any water. So most of the shallow pools that the dragonfly favours were completely dry. with dry sphagnum over the top or a cracked surface. So you can see a sort of a sphagnum-y crust in this picture here on the left-hand side. And this is a picture of we met up with Sarah Watts, the conservation officer from Carrower Estate. So they're really keen to carry out sort of management works to help the azure hawker. And I think what we're going to have to do is we'll be digging deeper pools so that there's going to be a greater depth that creates some sort of refuge for the dragonflies, especially the azure hawker, in the in drier summers, because the azure hawker larvae, they need 3 years in which to develop before they're ready to emerge. And maybe having one bad year where it's very dry, where the larvae can go down into the moss as far deep down and survive without much movement or whatever for one summer might be possible, but I can't imagine that they would survive over three years doing that and not being able to feed properly either. So that's quite worrying. I do wonder if that's the shape of things to come with hotter summers. But northern damselfly, they're found in three areas round about the Cairngorms, northern Perthshire, Strathspey and Deeside, and they're found in shallow sedge. Oh, there's a wasp just flying past. They're found in shallow sedge-lined pools, again, which are drying up with hotter, drier summers. So we managed to get a survey carried out over the winter and to look at the condition of the northern damselfly ponds, and found 10 out of 43 were good, 19 were poor or marginal, and basically the outcome of that survey was that management demand to get these ponds back in any sort of good condition for the northern damselfly was critical. And you can see just from this picture here, you can see what once 20 years ago was a really good pond for northern damselfly now has trees growing in it along with all the sedges. It's only got about 10% open water now, and northern damselfly and other damselflies need far more than that, generally speaking. So we have been very, very lucky to get some funding from the Cairngorms National Park to carry out management works this winter, which will essentially involve removing trees from the ponds, digging deeper water, removing vegetation, putting in dams to raise the water level, and also creating new pools as sort of stepping stone ponds to improve habitat connectivity for the northern damselfly. So all records are valuable, especially now. We need to keep an eye on how things are changing. As I was saying, we don't really know what impact the new species is going to have on the existing species, but records are crucial, and if you can take a photo as well, then that's especially important. It's great if Pat gets an unusual sighting that she can look at it through a photo. So these are my details. So if anybody wants to get in touch about more information or to get involved in any recording schemes, then do please get in touch. The shape of dragonflies is changing all the time, and yeah, it'd be great to get all the more recorders involved to keep on top of it.
That's great. Thanks, Danielle. There's quite a few questions that have come in the question and answer box. We haven't got time to take them all just now, but maybe one of them which someone has asked is how has the changing number of records, the citizen science input, have you got any idea on how that has affected the trends? Are more people recording dragonflies now?
Yes, definitely. I think up to the new atlas in 2014, there was a huge push in getting people involved in carrying out more recording. And I think, so looking at recorder effort, I apologise if you can hear my dog barking in the background. He's got a bit of doggy dementia. Yeah, so if we were to look at the number of people recording, going up to just before the 2014 atlas was released, numbers really grew because there was a big push to get people involved. And then just after the atlas was produced, there was a bit of a drop off as people were maybe having a bit of a rest or going off to do something different. And then they've gradually been rising again. So yeah, having more recorder effort obviously means we're going to get more dragonfly records in. So yeah, citizen science volunteering is really, really valuable. It's really useful and it helps us a lot. Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much. If you could maybe have a look at those other questions in the question and answer box, and we'll see if we can get those answered as well. We're sort of slightly behind schedule, but not very much. We're just going to take a break now to enable you to go and get a cup of tea or coffee or go to the loo or whatever. And we're going to show a few slides just to fill the 10 minutes in the interval. Don't feel you have to sit and watch them if you don't want to, but we'll just take a break now and we'll be back in around 10 minutes. So we'll see you then. Bye for now. Okay, welcome back everybody. We're going to move swiftly on to our next speaker, who is Chris Catherine. I first met Chris longer ago than probably he or I care to remember, when I worked down in Dumfries and Galloway. I've subsequently worked with him when he was working for Bug Life, but he now runs his own consultancy business, Caledonian Conservation, and he's got a team of ecologists working with him. And we thought it'd be interesting to get Chris along just to give you a little insight into, we've talked already about collecting records, but hopefully Chris will be able to give you a little insight on some of the uses that those records are put to use with. So over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Peter. It was a while ago that we met. When would that be? Like 2006 or something like that, maybe. Anyway, a while ago. Hold on, I'm just going to try and share my screen, which worked earlier, so she'll hopefully work now. 1 second, my speaker things appeared in the way of putting up the presentation. Right, cool. Hopefully that is good. So, yeah, so I'm Chris Catherine. I'm the Director of Caledonian Conservation. That's the main hat I'm wearing today. I have many other hats and I will touch on some of those along the way. But yeah, I was asked if I could give a talk about how the data that you guys collect, I collect this kind of data too as a volunteer, but how it can be used in different ways. And certainly Caledonian Conservation makes use of all sorts of different kinds of data when we put together reports for different purposes. So as an overview, I'm just going to tell you a bit about Caledonian Conservation, so you have a context as to what we are, what we do, and how we might be using data. And then I'm going to go into talking about data itself, providers, types, and limitations. And then I'm going to give 3 case studies, which I think show how data can be used differently and how different data can be useful for different purposes. So I'm going to talk about a wind farm, which is a type of development, of course, which is probably what most people think of when they think of consultancy and use of data. And I'll also talk about invertebrate site condition monitoring, so looking at protected sites and the condition that they're in, which also makes use of data. And then a wee bit on non-native species, and because I'm sure everybody hears an awful lot about non-native plants spreading around, I'm going to just talk about alpine newt. And being as it is that I'm also a trustee for amphibian reptile groups of the UK and love my reptiles and amphibians, that's maybe not surprising. And then there'll just be some conclusions and we can talk a wee bit about data too. I'm sorry that none of the examples are particularly Southwest Scotland focused. I'm a bit limited in terms of what's in the public domain that I can access enough of the information to show you. So everything that I'm talking about here is in the public domain in the same format or the same information is available elsewhere. But you don't get me talking about it elsewhere. So Caledonian Conservation, we were established in March 2010. So we had our 10th anniversary during the viral apocalypse, and I'm looking forward to celebrating that with my employees at some point and some people from the past perhaps. We're an ecological consultancy, and we're based near Bridge of Allan, and we cover all of Scotland and beyond. So we work throughout the UK, and before the end of the world, we also worked in other countries such as Isle of Man and whatnot, Ireland, and we currently, in fact, are involved with and support a project in India, which one day I would love to actually go and physically see. We have 8 members of staff at present, and we work with well over 20 different associate ecologists. So these are people that we would subcontract to provide specialist skills, because I'm a big fan of using people who have the right skills for jobs. What do? We work on developments such as wind farms, solar parks, different kinds of buildings like commercial and residentials, infrastructure like railway and roads. We do all sorts of things. And for developments, we all do surveys, which gets us to wonderful wild places. Something I enjoy, get to go camping. We do the whole range of ecology surveys, or terrestrial ecology and freshwater ecology anyway, within our team. So mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians. There's a Dumfries and Galloway specialist, natterjack toad, some toadlets, they're so cute. Invertebrates, that's a Scottish speciality, more or less. There are a few records in England, but it's the lichen running spider. And plants, and I picked bryophytes because I'm sure that Julie Smith, who works with me, would be very pleased that I focus on bryophytes rather than all the other plants that everyone else loves. We do ecological impact assessments, which involves analysing data. And it's quite fun. I quite like doing the surveys. I love doing surveys, but it's quite fun then using your data and interpreting it and seeing the project through, discharging planning conditions, ecological clerk of work, such as on this railway project where some slowworms had to be protected whilst a railway embankment was repaired. That was actually in Dumfries and Galloway. Post-consent monitoring after something has been built, translocations. This is a wood ant nest being translocated to allow a school to be built. We do work for non-governmental organisations and charities, surveys, research, help with conservation management, and we do public interpretation, and we increasingly get involved with film and TV. Relatively recently, although you can see that's quite a long time ago. My hair has gotten a bit longer since, but we have gone through the apocalypse. This was an Australian film about spiders that focuses on some Tasmanian spiders. It's called 16 Legs, but it takes a world view and then zooms in. That was really fun to be involved with, and we've also helped get it out on Blu-ray. It did get released in cinemas, but this happened just before and during the COVID pandemic, and it never got a proper release over here that I'm aware of. But the Blu-ray is coming. It's narrated by Neil Gaiman and has Stephen Fry and all sorts of other far more interesting people than me in it. And we helped different people with information and with filming and stuff, different organizations, including BBC and whatnot. We do advocacy, we represent organizations in specialist capacities sometimes. We're currently supporting this urban biodiversity project in Mumbai. And we support Ghostbusters of Glasgow, which is totally different. And they raise money for Glasgow Children's Hospital charity. We do work for statutory nature conservation organisations, so like Nature Scot, and it's just the same stuff, surveys, management stuff. We help design new standard methods, though sometimes, and also sometimes are involved in writing guidance, such as this reptile guidance, although this was actually published by ARG UK and signed up to by the other herp charities rather than Nature Scot in the end. We do work for other government agencies and local authorities. Different things there would be inputting into policy and providing expert advice on planning decisions and partnership research projects, and specimen identification, like this wandering spider that came in with some bananas, just to be stereotypical, in the northeast of Scotland at one point. We do teach at universities as external lecturers, and we do training and events for schools, community groups, whoever. There's some kids out doing bug hunting, because who doesn't love doing bug hunting? We try to make as much of what we do available free and publicly, so you can download papers and reports and things as much as we are able to make available from our website. And so, for example, the slides from this presentation will at some point become available there as well. So do check that out. Moving on to data. Why would you want to use data? Well, you can identify potential site sensitivities. So if I'm going to work on a project, it could be a development, could be looking at some peatland restoration, whatever it might be, before I ever get on site, before I ever design surveys, I can look at historic data and get an idea of what the sensitivities might be and where I need to focus effort. And that can also inform the design process from an early stage. So if it's development, they could avoid certain areas perhaps, or they know the kind of mitigation already that they're going to have to incorporate into the project from day one. Or if it's a habitat management project, then they might know that you might identify areas of habitat to avoid impacting, or because they may already be of conservation importance, or there may be features that are important for species present on a site that might need to be retained and considered. It can inform ecological appraisals, can inform survey design. Data provides a context for an ecological impact assessment. So you can say, this is what we found, this is the wider area and how things are, and this is how things have been in the past. And then you can start saying how you think things might be in the future. It helps with monitoring, and it helps us understand the conservation status of species. So we know which species are of conservation concern to focus on when we're doing assessments or designing research, and it can help us understand distribution. Data is great. So there's various kinds of data. So you could have casual and or anecdotal data, verified data, detailed, population level, movements or behavior. It's important to know how animals behave. Protected sites, broad habitats, detailed habitats, geological information. There's all sorts of data that there could be. And there's lots of different sources as well, such as NBN, local record centres, various charities, recording schemes, different kinds of research. And I must apologise, I think this presentation often refers to Scottish Natural Heritage, SNH, rather than Nature Scot. However, I think Nature Scot is a trading name and that SNH is still the legal entity. So it's not entirely incorrect. So anyway, SNH have got lots of data that is available, or Nature Scot, depending on what you want to call them. When you're working with data, there's some considerations and limitations. So you need to be cognizant of permissions, licenses. And these are the 4 main licenses that are on NBN at the moment. There are other kinds of licenses too, but these 3, Open Government, Creative Commons 0, and Creative Commons with attribution, are all data sets that I can use, unless there's some particular thing noting not to, in the commercial work or research work that I do, whereas the non-commercial data sets I can't use without specific permission from the data provider. So I would encourage people to make data available in those other 3. My personal favorite is actually the share alike license, which doesn't seem to be available on NBN, but just because I would like to encourage everybody to share their data and what they do with it. You need to consider accuracy. So is a record of a particular species in a particular place likely to be correct? Is the grid reference likely to be correct? How accurate is that record? And resolution as well, and that can be very important. Is the resolution high enough for purpose? You could have a super accurate record which says that the top expert in pine martens recorded a pine marten in Scotland, and that's it. And that's not going to be very useful for informing any kind of work that I would be doing, other than saying, yes, we can confirm pine martens are in Scotland. Whereas a record that's maybe 6 figures or better gives them a much better indication, is far more useful for the kind of work that I tend to do. Confidentiality and sensitivity. So there can be sensitivities with regard to how individuals want their data to be used. There can also be sensitivities with regards to the status of species and conservation concern or threats. So it's not always possible to share data at the highest possible resolution. And under-recorded groups are always something to be aware of. So, for example, reptiles, invertebrates. That's a beautiful lemon slug. Basically, there's not a lot of records for some of these, and it's always important to remember that absence of records does not demonstrate absence of the thing itself from a site. So now we've looked at data, just going to start going through these case studies, these examples. So this is Craig Rayvac Wind Farm, which is a wind farm in the Highlands that's actually currently being constructed, although we're not involved in that stage of things. We did work on the pre-application stuff, and it's, yep, up there. Initially, the project was for a wind farm with 37 turbines and the associated infrastructure, so tracks, crane pads, control buildings, grid connection, up on a high area in the far north of Scotland. So that was the original plan. Just to stress, this isn't what has ended up happening, and we'll go through that. Data plays a role. So in terms of data, the first thing that I did was looked at data for protected sites, and there are lots of protected sites around there of different kinds. And this is just a map of the special areas of conservation, SACs. There's SPAs up there that are very similar in boundaries, to be honest. So there's Caithness and Sullivan Peatlands SAC and SPA, which is adjacent to the site. And there's also SWSEIC Knock-and-Alaska, which is adjacent to the site. And that's the final site boundary. The original site boundary was larger. That's from the environmental statement that was publicly available. We also went to data providers. So contacted lots of individual organizations such as Highland Biological Recording Group, which should, I believe, be equivalent to this organization down here. SWSEIC, I believe it's called. I didn't know how to say that until this morning. So that's cool. Anyway, RSPB, BTO, Raptor Study Group, Scottish Badgers, lots of different organizations. And if I was working on a project in the Central Belt, or perhaps even south of Scotland, there would probably be more organizations that I would be able to contact to get data from. It can be quite a long list depending on the remit of your job, your project, but the far north of Scotland is a little bit poorer in terms of data providers. So the data was used to inform novel surveys, so the surveys that we did to look at things in more detail. So we did bird flight activity surveys, breeding raptor and owls, and we were able to focus or design our survey areas to suit the species that we thought were likely to find based on the historic data available. So we did a very wide area raptor survey for golden eagles, for example, because they have massive territories and could be affected from quite a distance compared to, say, a merlin. We looked at breeding divers, black grouse, general breeding birds, protected mammals, and we did some quite detailed work with protected mammals to look for cryptic species such as pine marten and wildcat, freshwater pearl mussel, phase 1 habitats, NVC habitats. And the data actually allowed us to remove bats from the scope of the work because of the location of the site and the very low sensitivity and likelihood of impacting bats. And that allowed us to focus our resources on the other sensitivities. So it didn't reduce in less effort. It's just we put the effort into the places that really needed it. And did detailed habitat mapping. The peatland habitats are a feature of the adjacent SAC, so we had to look at how we may be impacting those. Mammal surveys with camera traps. We put a lot of effort into the raptor surveys, so that's eagle surveys in March. A lot of the terrain was very inaccessible and required long walk-ins, hence the camping. Flight activity surveys, some golden eagle flights that are in the environmental statement. Breeding waders. So we collected a lot of data. The data also was used to inform the assessment. So for example, we did golden eagle population modeling, and we couldn't have done that without having access to other data sets. It allowed us to identify sensitive areas for species and habitats, and it informed the design process. So the development area was almost halved based on the habitats present and that type of thing. And the number of turbines they were looking at was reduced to 22. And this has all come as a result of data, ultimately. And it informed the habitat management plan and mitigation. This project has gone on to, well, is currently working on restoring an area of peatland, which is much larger than the area that the wind farm is taking up, more than an order of magnitude larger. And it allowed impacts to be assessed and mitigation designed. So what kind of data did we ask for? Well, we asked for example, any eagle records within 6 kilometers, all other bird species of conservation concern within 2, bat records within 20, other protected mammals within 2, amphibians or reptiles within 2, fish within 5. We did quite a detailed aquatic assessment as well as part of this with a chap called Chris Conroy. And we looked at invertebrates within a couple of kilometers. And that's quite an interesting one, actually, because there was a rare spider that came up through that with data via SNH data from SWSEIC work, Sites of Special Scientific Interest. It was a slightly convoluted route, won't go too much into that just now, but that did mean we were able to take into account a rare spider in the assessment and design for the habitat enhancements and botanical and habitat information within 500 meters, although in reality we did look beyond that with data sets that were available. So in that case, the data was really useful in terms of not just avoiding large impacts on species on the site, or habitats for that matter, but also allowed us to design mitigation and enhancements that really targeted and benefited the species in the area, or that perhaps were in the area in the past and have declined since. So the next case study is site condition monitoring. So site condition monitoring is something which is done for protected sites or has been done in the past. And so sites of special scientific interest will have features that are the site is designated for, and some of those may be invertebrates, as is in this case. They may be birds, they may be plants. There's geological SSSIs as well. We never do any of those, but we do the whole gamut of others. And I'm just going to talk about invertebrates because that's really what I like. But we do site condition monitoring for other groups. And this is something we have done for Nature Scott. That's site condition monitoring on the rum cooling. That was fun. The majority of this is available in publicly available reports, and that's where the maps and things have come from. You can get those from the link down there, or you can also get them via links on my company's website, although it's just going to take you to the same place, more or less, just to the direct report. But they're worth a read. There's also a few reports that we have submitted to Nature Scott that were signed off but haven't been made publicly available yet, to my knowledge, and those are those there. I'm sure that if you wanted to read them, you could contact Nature Scott and request them. And maybe one day they will be publicly available if they aren't already. Certainly they aren't to my knowledge. We also publish papers and stuff sometimes in relation to this, which you can read on or download for free from our website, as well as other presentations we've given on this, different aspects of it. And the data is on NBN, so you can look at the data. So in Scotland, we have 158 SSSIs that have invertebrate features. And you can read all about them in Nick Littlewood's excellent report there, which is available on the Nature Scott website. So far, we have looked at 57 site survey projects, which have encompassed 51 SSSIs. So we've looked at quite a few. Those are all the pink ones on the map there. You can see it, some of them are quite big. It's alarming when a site, you can see a site's obvious shape on a full map of Scotland at that scale. And I'm not going to go through all of them. I've just picked a few that we've done over the years that show how data can be used perhaps in different ways or different kinds of data. So starting off with a really simple example, Ochtertyre moss. So it's a lowland raised bog in Stirling area. It's quite small. And I was looking for the bog sunjumper Heliophanes damphi, which has been found in Dumfries and Galloway now, which is cool, but it's not known from very many sites. But I love it. Beautiful spider. I have a wee one on my desk. Here we go. Somebody made that for me, which is lovely. Anyway, sorry, I digress. So in the past, the bog sunjumper has been recorded at this site from these two locations. Now, I wasn't able to get near one of them because since this survey had been done, lots of felling operations had taken place and it just wasn't safe to get further onto the bog. But I was able to survey around one of them. I did a little pitfall trapping and active sampling, and I found bog sunjumper there, which is great. And so I knew I had a distinct area to survey. That whole site is habitat suitable for bog sunjumper. It probably is all over the site. And I had the records which helped me target my efforts. Easy peasy. Cane locking, not quite as easy initially. It's a very big site, and I was looking for a very small spider, only a couple of millimeters at most, Mechnargus patrulus, the Scottish mountain spider. But I knew where it's found, elevations above 850 meters and associated with Nardus strictus matgrass snowbed habitats. And I knew when it had been found in the past. As you can see, it's a very big triple SI, and it's mountainous and difficult to access. So looking for a spider that's less than 2 millimeters long in that area, it's tricky without targeting a bit more, especially with the amount of resources available for these projects. But I had historic records, as you can see at the top of the ski centre, which I guess is pretty accessible. You can actually drive up to the top of Miel Odar anyway, and then walk up to the top of Glassmill. If you have a 4x4 and if you have permission, you can't just do it off the road. That's not permitted, so don't do that. Anyway, did lots of sampling around the areas that had been found before, including setting pitfall traps there. But I actually found it over there, which curiously, well, that's the habitat, which is what would be expected. This is where I was camping. This is where I found it. So I put a lot of effort in not to find the spider, only to find it outside my tent. But that's cool, found lots of other cool things. But here, because of the historic records, I was able to target my surveys to a particular area, which was helpful because I did not have much time to look for the spider. Similar challenges with Torridon Forest. I've actually done surveying at Torridon Forest several times for different features. 3 times, in fact, for different things. It's a big area. It's really tough terrain. If you've been up there, you will know this. It's my favorite part of Scotland, but it isn't easy going. In this case, I was able to get data from NBN. I think it was just before it became NBN Atlas, so the interface was slightly different. And I think, unfortunately, that some of the data sets there from SNH or NatureScot now are no longer available on Atlas, unless they've been added since last time I checked. But in any case, I was able to get this data. It's a good example of resolution. You can see there's a record. That's a giant orange square covering a huge area with several mountain peaks in it. That's low resolution, not very helpful for targeting surveys on these mountains for a beetle, which is Photora polaris, a leaf beetle I was looking for. Whereas those other dots, the ones that are more precise, the sort of the 6-figure grid reference ones, they're better. You can target things far better with that. I can see at least which mountain they were recorded on. Also, another source of data, a blog. Mark Telfer, absolute beetle legend, had been out surveying for this beetle in the past, and he wrote a blog about it, which was also a very entertaining read. And that helped me target my surveys, which again, not much time, only had a few days to do this in. So, approach from this absolutely beautiful corrie up Benny, up the Stone Chute. Stephen Falk kindly took a photo of me going up the Stone Chute. It was me there. And I did active sampling on top, and I found Photora polaris, yay. And also, oh, sorry, I will tell you about the also in a second. This is where I sampled, and I found at these locations. And I also found Stenis glacialis, a rove beetle, which I have been looking for at this point for like 10 years. I've been to so many sites it had been known from. It was not known from this site, but I found it here. And it is a mountain species, so it's not totally unsurprising, but that was awesome. And Stenis glacialis leads us into another kind of data. Museum collections, reference collections. These are super important. So Stenis glacialis, I would not have been 100% confident in identifying that species without access to things like this. And there's loads of rove beetles in particular that you can't identify the species without comparing to specimens. So voucher specimens are important for a lot of groups, so do collect those if that's the kind of recording you're doing, and also make use of reference collections and make your own reference collections. I've got quite a reference collection of my own, but yeah, not everything in it, obviously. Museums are great. Again, return to Torridon Forest. They're not really returned because that was 2017, this is 2011, so this is going back in time. The first time I went to Torridon Forest. So we've talked about the last time and then now the first time. Micaria alpina, was the spider I was to look for there, the alpine ant spider on this occasion, and it's found above 750 meters and is associated with Vastanum myrtillus and Dracometrium. So I've got an idea of the habitats that it lives in and the elevation that it's at. In this case, I did not have a record, so I did not know where it had been found when I started this survey. There was no record that SNH at the time could provide, and I tried to get in contact with the original recorder, but it took a while for him to get back to me, but he did, which is great. So I looked at habitat data, which was available, and elevations, and targeted my surveys to areas where that was accessible and possible. I say accessible, it took a wee bit of effort, but it was worth it. So I camped out on Liach for this survey. But unfortunately, I didn't find the spider. It turned out that the record was erroneous, and it had actually been found at another SWSEIC, Knock-on-Alaska, which is the one that's adjacent to that wind farm site we talked about first. It seems that there was human error, and the Macaria alpina and Erigone cycrophila were both reported in this one article at from two different sites, and it seems the grid reference for Erigone cycrophila was used and assigned to both of those by SNH when looking at features for SWSEICs, when in fact only Erigone cycrophila had been found at Tordon Forest. And sure enough, it's there in abundance, but Erigone cycrophila has since been found to be on top of pretty much every mountain in Scotland in abundance, so it's no longer a feature. So yeah, unfortunately, Macaria alpina was never found there, and as far as I'm aware, it has not been added to Knock-on-Alaska, despite that being where it's from. And that's far more interesting, because it's lower elevation than you would expect, although that area has habitats and plants growing at lower elevations than you'd expect. I guess it's a reflection of its northerly location and harsh environment. Cairngorms, 2013. The cairngorms are huge. The cairngorms are about 300 kilometers square site, and they're all sorts of habitats, and the feature is very poorly defined in the citation. And we did manage to get unpublished records from the site, although some of them were not very precise, or they weren't very good resolution. And it was just groups of species largely, although some individual species were named. But it was quite tricky to do in that area. So what we did do is we looked at habitats and things, and also some of the named species we were aware of, and we selected broad survey areas. We couldn't survey the whole site. I think we had like 10 or 15 days. And so, yeah, we did that. I'm only going to look now at mollusks and odonata. And in fact, we've heard about a lot of the dragonflies that are relevant here, but I'm just going to look at the data anyway just now. So there's really good dragonfly data for the site, which allowed us to go back to precise locations and compare data between years, which is exactly what you really want to be doing in this kind of monitoring project, which is fantastic. So excellent data on the dragonflies. Not so much on other things. So for the mollusks, we narrowed down the survey. So it's really some rare snails, some whorl snails we're looking for. And we narrowed down our survey areas for those based on the geology, because, well, elevation and geology. The snails were known to occur at particular elevations, but snails don't really like acidic environments, and most of the cairngorms are acidic. So we looked at the underlying geology, and we were able to narrow down the survey areas based on that with some habitat data too. And so that helped us target our surveys. And just a wee footnote on Rum. I love Rum. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. There's Glenn, who used to work for me, absolutely brilliant ecologist, doing some vacuum sampling on top of Halaval, I think. So there's been exceptional work completed on Rum by Peter Wormel, former warden, but the records and reports seem to have been lost through pulping, which I've since been told may have been due to an asbestos issue, but they weren't digitized beforehand. So there don't seem to be copies, unfortunately. And Wormel has published articles in journals, so they remain. But the original records and reports, a lot of them have been lost, although his daughter does still have some, and I think there's an intent to have those digitized. But it just to me seems tragic to just destroy that information without having copies. And so the invertebrate assemblage feature in this case was defined purely based on habitats, upland, peatland, and coastal, as they are named. And I mean, there is a butterfly feature which is better defined, or moth feature rather, and we did look at that, but that's another story for another day. The general invertebrate stuff, that's what we did. We looked at as many places as we could in the limited time that we had. Now, final case study, non-native species, alpine newt. They're very cute. Alpine newts are super cute, but they are not native to Scotland. And this is a map taken from Record Pool, which is kind of like a slush bucket for reptile and amphibian data for people to record casually, perhaps in areas that don't have good access to record centers or whatever. But it's a super useful tool. And I've just added that square there because I know that there is a population in Helensburgh as well. So that is the known distribution of alpine newts in Scotland at the moment, but they probably are under-recorded. If you zoom in, it's very central belt focused, which could reflect recorders. It could reflect that people have alpine newts more in places where there are more people. I don't know, but this is where they are just now. And interestingly, I only verified this record a couple of weeks ago, so that's pretty new. And zooming in further, it's not just a case of like one or two populations. In Edinburgh, as you can see there, they seem to be distributed around about the city. So in the past, it was thought that there was like a population of alpine newts here, a population here, but it seems actually that either they're spreading or there are more populations. And the really interesting thing about the alpine newt stuff, for me anyway, is that almost every record that I've gathered recently or found recently or got access to recently has been recorded as a completely different species. So they've been recorded as lizards, other species of newts, but not as alpine newts. And I've been able to verify the records and confirm which species they are because of photographs that have been appended to the records. So that's really powerful, I think. And without that, we wouldn't have this knowledge of where alpine newts are right now. Maybe we would think they were just in one or two places. Now, they're native to Central Europe, and the reason to really be worried about them here is that they're an asymptomatic carrier of amphibian diseases, which can negatively affect our native species. So far, I think 2 populations have been tested in Scotland, and they've come back negative for chytrid, which is a fungus which is affecting amphibians worldwide. But obviously not all of these populations have been tested. They're still available to buy in the UK. You can certainly get them ordered and delivered to your house. I don't know if garden centres still sell them to enhance ponds, but they were doing so just before COVID still. And I guess I don't think there's anything technically illegal about putting an alpine newt in your pond, in your garden. However, it is illegal to allow a non-native species to spread into the wild or to occur in the wild here. And I have no idea how you would keep an alpine newt in your garden. It seems like a generally bad idea to me. And yeah, that's just a map showing chytrid fungus, which is one of the diseases that alpine newts can spread. And taking them from captivity and then into the wild is a really risky strategy in terms of biosecurity, because they may have been bred alongside other species from other places in the world, and chytrid often spreads within these environments. So that we now have in Scotland, Edinburgh, a spreading population, Newbridge, a spreading population. Helensburgh doesn't seem to be spreading. I think it's just in a garden pond is all that I'm aware of, but probably under-recorded. Glenboig is a relatively new population, and that's concerning because it is alongside the biggest population of great crested newts that we have in Scotland. And Crook of Devon is new. They appear to be moving along railway embankments, and I think there's also a risk of them dispersing along the Union Canal. All of our native species breed in the Union Canal at different points, and there are populations of alpine newt right next to it, so I don't see why they wouldn't also breed and disperse using the Union Canal. Anyway, please record alpine newts if you see any, or if you record things, put photographs on them, because then it can help people who know more about things than you may do, that particular thing, to identify it. I don't know everything about everything, so it's always good to have a photo. So in conclusion, it's important for me to use the right data for the project. That could be species specific, it could be to do with habitats, or it could be on a grand landscape scale. It could be all of those things. It's important to be aware of permissions and also the limitations of data. Confidentiality and sensitivity is very important. And that's important to you as recorders as well, I would hope. And if you have the opportunity to flag up a recorder as sensitive. Under-recorded groups are always something to be aware of, because absence of records doesn't demonstrate absence of that species. With regards to recording, please never destroy historic data. Please hang on to it. Keep on recording with as much detail as possible. So what you found, where you found it, when you found it, and who you are all very important bits of information for someone like me who might use your data. Photographs are super helpful, and please share your data or make your data available to people to use. Otherwise, it's just really sitting there and maybe isn't as useful as it could have been. Maybe it could have helped avoid some kind of impact on something, but because of the permissions, the people looking at that project weren't able to use your data. And also, just as a side note, Caledonian Conservation's data is available on NBN, although we're always a bit behind in uploading because nobody pays for the time and we're always super busy. And as a sort of total final thing, it'd be remiss of me not to mention grass snakes, because they do appear to be as a stronghold in Dumfries and Galloway, and there's very few records. They are the rarest snake in Scotland, so I would encourage you to please record grass snakes, and there's a link there. And that brings me to the end of the talk.
Thank you, Chris. I'm conscious that the time's pushing on, so I'm not going to take any questions just now, but I do have some questions for you, so I'm going to put those in the Q&A, and hopefully you can have a look at those and see what you think.
No problem.
Those last few slides were critical for biological recording the world over, so I hope those of you who are watching pay particular attention to those last couple of slides, especially what sort of data we need from your records. Right, we'll move on to our last speaker, who needs no introduction, but I'll give him a brief one. Mark Pollard is the Centre Manager for SWSEIC. He previously worked as the National Coordinator for the Wetland Birds Survey for the Wildlife and Wetlands Trust, but he's been with SWSEIC in his various guises since the very beginning, which was 2004. He's the Centre Manager, and he's the only Centre Manager which the Centre's ever had in its existence. And Mark is going to finish off this morning's presentations by leaving. Come back, Mark. By just giving us a brief outline of some of the recent records that have been submitted to SWSEIC so far in 2021. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, so my talk just gives you a quick review of what's happened so far in 2021. Obviously, we're not quite through 2021 yet, so we haven't quite collated all the records that we usually get through in a year. So there's lots of different sources still to come in, which often come in towards the end of the year. So what I'm going to do today is just take a little bit of a view from some of the records that are available online, some that have been submitted live via some of the online recording websites like iRecord. I'm going to use those as the focus of most of the talk that I'm going to give you today. Most of the pictures that I show will be of things that have been recorded specifically by local wildlife recorders this year. So they're not all my photographs, they're photographs from you, the wildlife recorders in southwest Scotland. So many from iRecord, and it's useful just to know that anybody who uses this website now called iNaturalist, the records from that, as from this year, have been starting to filter through to the iRecord website as well for data sharing. So both of those platforms have got records coming through this year. So I'm going to start off, I'm going to go through a range of species groups. I apologize in advance for those I don't get through, because it's impossible in the time to cover every species group there. So apologies to spiders and flies who don't get an attention today. But hopefully I'll cover quite a few of the different groups and different things that people have recorded, highlight a few special and interesting species, and give you a little bit of a flavour of what's going on in our region. So start off very quickly by just showing you, reminding you what happened earlier this year. This is the maps from the Met Office showing how different temperature was to usual. These are the spring maps. So the one on the left is rainfall, and one on the right is temperature. So as you can see, spring was generally dry, particularly in the west of the region, but a little bit cool on average. And if we move through to summer, then you can see the dry weather really did continue. We had a very, very dry summer and generally quite warm. So warm, dry and sunny rather summarised 2021 in southwest Scotland. And it wasn't really until October that we got some prolonged wetter than average weather, and obviously that caused some rather nasty flooding in the east of the region. So when we start off in spring, one of the groups that often gets recorded early doors are the amphibians. They start to become to show themselves if you go out for a walk and you get any pools or ditches. Often you'll see frogs spawn early doors. First record this year was from about the 7th of February, and toads come a little bit later. They came about a month later, first record from the 10th of March, and that's a little bit later than usual. Usually they come, both of those species come a little bit earlier, but the first records this year seem to come a little bit later than usual. Amongst the amphibians, we also had some interesting records of some less common species. We found from recording, we had a couple of species, a couple of records of new sites of the great crested newt in our region. This is a protected species and is obviously one that we're obviously keen to get records of if people find them. So yeah, we had a new site, at least one, I think possibly two new sites in the region this year, which are always pleasing to receive. Not always easy to see some of these species. Obviously, the part of the life cycles in water and part of their life cycles on land, tucked away under stones and things like that. So they don't always turn up very easily. So it's always nice to get records of where they live. Reptiles are another species group that get a good bit of focus in spring, should I say. As the weather begins to warm up a little bit, it's a great time to see reptiles because they need to bask at that time of year to get their temperature up. This species, common lizard, is the most frequently recorded species in our region. I think we had online this year, we've had 66 records so far via iRecord. There'll be more through one or two other recording platforms as well, like the record pool that Chris mentioned. But so far, it's certainly the most frequently recorded species, and it typically is in our region. We've had a few records of adders as well. Secretive species, and obviously not a species that you see very often, but very distinctive if you do. And because they're typically under-recorded, always encourage people to record any of the reptiles that they see, because all the species have some form of protection under the wildlife legislation. And it's nice to have records of whereabouts these populations are in the region. Now, as spring warms up and heads towards summer, then this species group begins to dominate the records online. Butterflies are the most frequently recorded species on iRecord. I'll touch on birds later because most of the bird records go through a different recording platform. But butterflies certainly dominate the records. And this species, green-veined white, is the species that occurs most frequently in records in southwest Scotland. So if we look at the top 10, it's a species I'm sure you're all familiar with the grey dusting around the wings underneath, as you can see there. And if you look at the top 10 species of butterflies, the list on the left is the top 10 most frequently recorded species in 2021. I'm sure you'll see, if you look along some of those, you'll see butterflies that you'll be familiar with from your garden or out on the walks. The chart on the right shows how they fared in 21 compared to average. So those with green bars on the right are a little higher up the top 10 table, if you like, than usual, and those with red bars are a little bit lower down. So, for example, the red admiral there wasn't as many records as usual of red admiral this year, and indeed painted lady, which is another migrant species, it wasn't even in the top 10 species at all. So Not a good year for migrant butterflies, but one species sorry, my apologies. One species that does show up particularly well there is the wall butterfly. Now this species, these are photographs from our recorders this year, rather attractive orange and brown marbled coloured butterfly with these dark wing spots with tiny white highlights in them. Rather beautiful species, and one which seems to be doing quite well. Has certainly made the top 10 list when it usually doesn't. If we look at the distribution maps, you can see the map on the left here is taken from the 2004 records collated by the Regional Atlas for Southwest Scotland. And you can see very clearly that it's quite a coastal distribution. Not very many records inland at all. Now the map on the right is the records from iRecord, which iRecord was created in 2010-11 time. So most of the records are post that period. And I hope you can see from that more recently, there's been quite a lot more records inland, particularly in Dumfries and Galloway, than there ever used to be. It certainly seems to be spreading up the river corridors inland. And although so far it doesn't seem to have spread further north along the Ayrshire coast, it certainly could do, and it may be one to keep an eye out for moving up in the region as things spread. It's certainly spread within the south of the region and may well turn up further on the Ayrshire coast in future years. So it's worth keeping a lookout for that one. 31 different species of butterfly recorded last year, which is quite a good number if you think of the diversity in the region. That's quite a good number. And this species just merits a little mention, which is a brimstone butterfly, and we had records of those. A couple of records of those around the Dumfries area, and it'll be very interesting to see if we can get if that species hangs on and breeds in the region in future year. It's very common further south in England, an early emerging species in the south, and although its food plant's a little bit restricted north of the border, which may hamper it a little, it will be very interesting to see if this is a species that colonizes and becomes a more regular feature on albeit made perhaps locally in southwest Scotland. The cousins of butterflies are moths, and I put this slide up simply to highlight some of the rather diverse colours, shapes and sizes of these species. They're well recorded generally because we have quite a few active moth recorders, always welcome to have more, and obviously a very popular group for doing public events because they are indeed much more colourful and interesting than people would often have you believe. They're also, when it comes to recording, you can record different stages of the life cycle, much like some of the other invertebrate groups, but some of them have quite distinctive early stages. So caterpillars of things like the elephant hawk moth that you can see there, and in the bottom right, the rather bizarre looking old moth with the spoon-shaped appendages coming off each segment, two very distinctive caterpillars. You can even record them from some of the larval stages of some of the very tiny species, the micromoths. There are species that are so small that their larvae live within the surfaces of a leaf, and they're leaf miners, and some species can be found by looking at leaves and looking at the shape that the feeding pattern of the caterpillar creates within the leaf. You can even see on this one here that I spotted it because many of these leaf mines create what are called green islands, and the leaf delays turning brown. The bacteria associated with the larvae keeps photosynthesis going a little bit longer in the area around where the mine is. So looking for these green islands on leaves, either on trees or on the ground, is a good way for trying to find a leaf mining moth. Not easy to identify, but certainly very fascinating to be able to show children, for example. If you look at some of the interesting finds this year, this is a fairly rare species. It's a day-flying moth, metallic, called the forester, lives almost at the northern edge of its range in Dumfries and Galloway in damp, neutral grassland or unimproved habitats. And we have a new colony found north and west of the region as far as far up as Glen Truel, which puts them not a million miles away from the Ayrshire border. So I wonder if it might be a new species. I don't believe they've been recorded in Ayrshire so far. I may be incorrect on that, but if it may be a species that's worth looking out for elsewhere in the Galloway Forest Park, if suitable habitat's there, to see if there is a colony lurking somewhere in a quiet corner of Ayrshire. I should mention one or two of the browner species, just to give the fact that they're not all as colourful as the others, and they don't often share the same spotlight. So a couple of species there. The top right is a chamomile shark. The names of moths are part of their appeal for many species. That's an uncommon species. That was recorded in Ayrshire this year. Bottom right is called blackneck for obvious reasons, new to southwest Scotland this year. And indeed, the one on the left, the brown-veined wainscot, is new to Scotland this year, found in Dumfries and Galloway. Dragonflies, Danielle mentioned a little bit earlier, to give a little bit of a picture of what's going on in our neck of the woods. This species is the first to emerge and is also the most widespread and frequently recorded. And the large red damselfly features at the top of our top 10 species list in Dumfries and Galloway, and in Ayrshire. So there we go. You can see chart, much like we had earlier. Those with green bars to the right are higher up the table of top 10 species than usual, and those with red are a little bit lower down. So you can see that four-spotted chaser, for example, appeared to have quite a good year last year, and blue-tailed damselfly, common hawker, common blue, perhaps a little bit less well recorded than usual, so appearing less frequently in the records than they usually do. Outside the top 10, some interesting things that keep turning up are things like this southern hawk dragonfly, species which is spreading and has turned up more regularly over the last couple of years in Dumfries and Galloway, and will almost certainly start spreading elsewhere in the region. It does encroach into Ayrshire as well, both from the north, and will probably encroach in there from the south in Dumfries and Galloway in future years. Recognisable by those two bright greeny yellow headlights, if you like, on the front of their thorax there. It makes them quite a distinctive species, even in flight, actually. One nice thing we did have this year was a new species added to our local breeding species. This is a broad-bodied chaser, and was photographed, emerged near Cattle Douglas, and you can actually see it sat on its larval case, its exuvia, having just emerged from a pond. So this was confirmed as a breeding species in 2021 for the first time. If we head on to some of the other groups, we've got ladybirds, for example, feature quite highly amongst the beetles. Being colourful undoubtedly means that they get more records than many other species, and many of these are actually a lot easier to record than some of the more difficult groups. So it's no surprise that on the iRecord website, where a lot of general casual records come in, that they feature quite highly. So this year we had 14 different species. The one in the top left being the common one, which we all see, the 7-spot ladybird. But I've put up some pictures of some unusual species there, like different coloured species there. Cream spot ladybird on the right, the tiny 22-spot ladybird on the bottom right in yellow and black, and a rather uncommon one, which I think is 18-spot ladybird, recorded on the Rins of Galloway this year, which is not a common species in our region at all. So that was quite a nice find. Also amongst the beetles, one of the prominent groups that attract records are longhorn beetles. They can often be seen feeding on umbelliferous flowers in summer. Sometimes they'll even land on you if you're out for a walk in the woods where they're around. It's not uncommon for that to happen. And there's just 3 rather nice photographs of some of the species, the 4-banded, the speckled, and the 2-banded here, that were recorded during 2021. Amongst the other insect groups, bees, this one is worthy of a mention. Tree bumblebee. It's a rather distinctive bumblebee with its ginger thorax and then large black area on the abdomen with a white tip to the tail. This species has had a remarkable spread in the UK. I think it was first recorded in about 2001 It's first recorded in the south of England, a species which is fairly widespread on the continent, but hadn't been recorded in the UK previously. And this year, that year it was recorded in the south of England and has spread very, very rapidly since that time. It was first recorded in southwest Scotland around about 2011, I believe, roughly around about that time. And this year, if we look at the records on iRecord that have been coming through, this is the most frequently recorded bumblebee of all. And I know it does have some advantages over the other species in that the black and yellow species are a little bit more difficult to recognize, whereas this is quite a distinctive species. But nonetheless, the fact that it didn't even exist here 10 years ago and now is the most frequently recorded species is certainly rather remarkable. Another species which is doing well and has made a rather similar spread in the region is this one, which is a green shield bug. You can see 3 different stages of its life cycle here. At the top right, you have a tiny early stage instar nymph, and then a slightly more mature one on the bottom right, and on the left, the adult shield bug. When I first started in 2004, I was able to get a list of the shield bugs present in our region from the National Recording Scheme, and this species wasn't on that list. It wasn't even recorded in Dumfries and Galloway at that time. And since then, this has grown to be what is now the second most frequently recorded shield bug in the region. And it's one that's fairly broad habitat taste and can turn up in gardens as well. So it seems likely to be spread even further over the next few years. So one to look out for if you're doing your gardening and have a look in your vegetation, even at home. Plants, such a diverse species group, it's difficult to know what to focus on. So I've picked a couple of colourful species here. We have on the left the greater butterfly orchid, quite a widespread species in the region, although not common anywhere, but always a pleasure to see. And a much more localized orchid here on the right is the bee orchid, and there are several colonies in Dumfries and Galloway and in Ayrshire amongst the region. And I know that there was confirmed new colony this year in the Cucubrishire area, Cucubrishire coast, which was found earlier this year. And I know we had records elsewhere from existing sites. It often likes disturbed ground. So one of the reasons it may disappear from sites is that the ground becomes unsuitable for them as it vegetates up. So it needs quite a fairly specific habitat. So nice to see them still existing in the region this year. Also amongst the plants were some equally distinctive and interesting shaped and recognizable species, but ones which are not native to our region. So on the left, the American skunk cabbage, which inhabits wet, marshy places. And on the right, is a species called fringed water lily, not a water lily, but I think related to bog bean. And both species can be regarded as invasive non-native species. You can see from the shot on the bottom right that the fringed water lily has spread massively over one of the loch it was discovered on, and it can cause problems in certain places with navigation and recreational interests, for example, and obviously it can crowd out some of the more native vegetation too. So keep your eyes open for things, and always worth reporting anything of interest that you see. Even if it's just it may seem rather widespread. This species wasn't known from that site at all, the water lily, and it was a new record, in the region, albeit a rather undesirable one. But nonetheless, always down to people looking and taking the time to report that we get to know about these things. Mammals are a tricky species group to record, and often all we get to see is a fleeting glimpse or a disappearing bottom into the vegetation. And roe deer are the most frequently recorded mammals that we have. But also don't forget that you can record mammals without actually seeing them. So things like molehills are a perfectly good way of recording the presence of moles in a region without actually having to see the animal themselves. Camera traps are increasingly accessible to people, and this was some footage from one of the camera traps we put out as part of a project we were doing this year in the Galway Glens area, footage of a pine martin coming to a feeder in a garden there. So that was always a nice way of recording some things that are otherwise rather secretive to find. For birds, we have, as I mentioned, we don't get a lot of records of birds through the online recording sites that we mentioned earlier, the iNaturalist and iRecord, simply because bird track is the primary reporting mechanism for bird records in the UK. But one thing that did sort of stand out this year was this species. We had a big influx of rose-coloured starling into the UK, and a few of them made their way up into Dumfries and Galloway and Ayrshire. So we had records from Stranraer, Maidens, Kilmarnock of this species turning up alongside the resident fox starling flocks and providing a little colourful addition to a local species. And a quick note on this species from looking at the bird track records, I hope you'll be able to see a little bit here. This is a nuthatch, and these two charts show the frequency with which nuthatch has been recorded amongst birdwatchers' lists. So if we look at the Dumfries and Galloway one, you can see that they colonized the region probably about started to colonize about 30 years ago. I've been getting commoner ever since. So this year was not out of the ordinary. They've already spread throughout Dumfries and Galloway. And it was a typical year, but their spread continues further northwards. And if you look at the Ayrshire map, you'll be able to, distribution map here, you can see the shaded areas, the average number of records that the species, average number of lists that the species recorded in as the year goes on. And during the summer this year, you'll see that the dark line that bounces around above that indicates the number of lists that it was recorded in last year. And you can see that's way, way above average, and it continues to spread in Ayrshire. And I'm sure it's delighting some of the bird watchers up there to see them either in the woodlands or coming to their feeders. My final species group is just going to touch on some fungi. I couldn't resist putting this species up, mainly because of its name. I felt it was I felt rather sorry for this species. I'm sure it gets rather neglected, given it, and being called ugly milkcat, I thought it deserved a few moments in the spotlight amongst our local records this year. But not all species are toadstool shaped. We get some rather interesting club and spindle shaped species. So these were three rather pretty spindle and club species which we had recorded this year, all of which are fairly uncommon, and all of which are rather interesting species to see. Rose spindles on the left, more club on the top, and green earth tongue on the bottom right. One to look out for if you're in your garden is this rather pretty species, seen from late summer to autumn. If you look, grows on dead holly leaves. So it's a very tiny little species, but creates these rather beautiful parasols, mushrooms, little called holly parachute, which is rather wonderful name. So you can look for that. Not common, but might be one that you can look for either in your own garden or your own woodland if you can find a holly bush. And even better, maybe one to look out for is this in the winter months is hair ice, which is formed. This is an ice formation which shows up during particular weather conditions and seems to be an indicator of the presence of a particular fungal species called hair ice crust, which is present in decaying branches, logs, twigs, and when the weather's right, and it means that it causes ice to form in these rather unusual formations in and around the logs that it's present on. So one to look out for. Final slides, I'm simply going to touch on something not local, but rather global picture. A little picture of redwing here, and I'm going to show you a little animation that shows the value of wildlife recording in helping to paint a picture of our local wildlife. So this here is from a site called Eurobird Portal, and you can go on that website and have a look at migration movements. It pulls together data from all the different bird recording schemes around Europe and has animated it to be able to show the movements. So this map here shows the distribution of redwing. In May, as of this year, they're already left UK and are already heading back to their breeding grounds in Scandinavia and Iceland. So if I animate this, you will see that the records track the movement of the birds back onto their breeding grounds, and then being a little bit quieter during the summer months and harder to detect. And then as autumn comes along, you'll start to see the influx back into Southern Europe and their migration starts, and it ends, the slide ends here, right at last week's distribution of records. So some fascinating, amazing what you can do with wildlife records and the picture you can tell of our natural world. It's a great example and use of that. So just to emphasize how valuable wildlife recording is. So do take a little bit of time to submit some records, send them in either into one of the online or through to your record centre or county recorder, and share them, like Chris said, so that they can be used for all sorts of things. Thank you very much for that. And hopefully I'll be able to rejoin you now.
Thanks, Mark. We caught up a little bit time-wise, but I think we've probably answered most of the questions which have been posed. We'll go back and have a look through it, and if there's anything that we've missed, we'll try and cover it. But I think we've covered everything that most people were wanting to ask. The number of records is increasing in Southwest Scotland and everywhere else. Submitting records online is not what everyone wants to do, but there's no doubt that it does increase the number of records, and it does make those records available. So the sort of things that Mark was talking about there is what we've picked up from looking at iRecord, but you can of course look at iRecord at any time and see those records for yourself. So as Mark and the other speakers have said, please do continue to make those recordings. By all means, enjoy your wildlife. That's what it's all about. But hopefully the wildlife records that you supply are very useful to a whole range of different people as well. I'm just going to sort of finish off by, first of all, thanking all of the speakers who have given us different perspectives on wildlife recording in Southwest Scotland and wider afield. Special thanks to Miriam, who's not only given us a presentation, but she helped us pull together the whole event. And the organisation that she works for, Garnock Connections Landscape Partnership, has helped fund some of this event. We also have to thank Nature Scot for their continued funding of SWSEIC, for the staff costs associated with SWSEIC. But most of all, I'd like to thank all of the recorders, all of you who've watched this, but the other recorders who are out there enjoying themselves watching wildlife, but also contributing some extremely valuable information. We do still have another, Mark put on the chat, we do still have another walk coming up next week in Irvine. If you want to join us, there's still a few places available. But apart from that, all I can say is that it's been a difficult 18 months or so, but the number of records has continued to increase, and hopefully looking ahead in the future, the COVID position will improve and we'll be able to get out more widely and collect even more wildlife records. So thank you very much for joining us this morning, and we look forward to seeing you at some point in the future. Bye for now.